Good morning, Patrick, and good afternoon, good evening, and our participants from Asian Pacific time zone. So welcome back to Digital Futures PhD Consortium. Today, it's a great honor for us to have Patrick Schumann coming back again to give the fifth lecture for the PhD program. The topic today will be the rationality of aesthetic values. So today, I think that the keywords goes to historical transformation of aesthetic values and the code of beauty, the mystery of beauty, formal priorial ideum and aesthetic values, necessities of aesthetic revolutions, aesthetic values, and designers versus end users, order versus chaos as universal across historical aesthetic regimes. So let's welcome Patrick to give the screen back to you. So welcome.
Thanks again. Happy to be back. Lecture 5. It's been a nice week for me of reflection, of discussion.
It's a great time.
And yeah, I had a good time so far. So let's see. Yeah, today is on the rationality of aesthetic values, but I have to first complete what I have couldn't fully finish yesterday, which is the lecture on the theory of styles, architectural styles in particular. So I will pick up there, and then in the second half of today's lecture, I will cover the rationality of aesthetic values, which isn't such a long lecture anyway. So the concept of style is it's a bigger topic in my work, although of course there have been volumes of theoretical texts and polemics written on aesthetic values too. Okay. I will share my screen. One second. Oh, what have I done here? Okay, yeah, here we go. Yeah, is that in view? Theory of Architectural Styles, Part 2. So, first reminder, the raison d'être, reason for being of architectural discourse, and therefore of an academic discipline, is innovation. And that's what we will talk about also relative to styles. You have innovation within styles and innovations as you move from style to style. That's the progress of architecture, tracing and tracking the progress of human civilization. So I've some of these graphics and the way my typography in these slides is a bit mixed because I've also been picking out of previous lectures partly. So the concept of style should also be discussed in relation to the distinction of avant-garde versus mainstream, which is now I think, permanent institution or communication structure within our discipline. So when it comes to innovation, we talk about avant-garde styles, means the first stage of the development of a style. It appears as within an avant-garde movement, as an avant-garde style, and then is aspiring, obviously, to move mainstream and take over the whole of the discipline. That trajectory of Parametricism hasn't happened yet. So we're in a strange limbo condition where we are in avant-garde styles for a little bit too long. Namely, not quite 30 years, but I would say 25 years of avant-garde style is quite a battle. So anyway, so avant-garde style established the conditions for collective cumulative design research, and that's very important. That there is this movement, and I described how it came together in the early 90s, mid 90s, and took off. And this is about, framing and posing problems. Clearly, I mean, when the theoretical element comes in as well, and even before you name a style, the movement, certain movements emerge that even if they don't have a name yet, they have perhaps, there's articles come along with that. That happened also strongly, of course, in the development of that style in the 1990s. A lot of discussion, of course, about the medium, the new medium of digital design media and algorithmic design, and at the same time, a lot of discussion of philosophical issues coming out of Deleuze and Guattari, many concepts coming in, which have to do with absorbing, let's say, the new conditions, socioeconomic and political and cultural conditions, which had condensed in some abstract, interesting and potent terms in Deleuze and Guattari. These were discussed a lot. So framing and posing problems in a literature which rolls along and spurns and clarifies and directs a burgeoning movement, an avant-garde movement, which then is already maybe an avant-garde style, which then later on becomes maybe more recognized and formalized. So formulating pertinent goals, what are we trying to achieve, how are we going to address these problems, and then strategically constraining the search or solution space where we find these goals. This is what I later want to talk about, the formal heuristics in particular of a style where there's a certain concepts, solution concepts which drive the design research forward in these avant-gardes. That's very important. I discussed yesterday how it's important to stick to one's guns if one has these intuitions about how best to solve it. And initially, in the initial stages, is obviously would be maybe sometimes quicker to just model things by hand, draw things by hand, instead of going through the detour of building up full parametric models, etc. But that detour, that insistence of doing it, inverted commas, within the framework and within the dogmas, inverted commas, of that new movement is important. So I've pulled out again some of the theses. I started in lecture 1 or lecture 2 to present some of the theses. So everything I'm talking about there, I've condensed also into theses in both volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. We're still in volume 1 largely. So avant-garde versus mainstream. The distinction between avant-garde and mainstream is constitutive of architecture's evolution or autopoiesis. Only by differentiating the avant-garde as specific subsystem can modern or contemporary architecture, I should have said perhaps, actively participate in the evolution of society. I'm saying in modern architecture because the avant-garde condition was first established clearly in the 20th century, leading to modernism. So we have a lot of these avant-garde movement and manifestos, in fact, quite interesting and modeled on, let's say, avant-garde political movement, radical political parties and manifesto, like critically the Communist Manifesto. So you have you obviously have things like the Constructivist Manifesto, very important manifesto, the Futurist Manifesto first, actually, then the Constructivist Manifesto, Suprematist Manifesto, etc. in that space. And quasi-manifestos of radical functionalism, etc., etc. So this started in the 1920s. And you have magazines, you have exhibitions, and you have manifesto projects. You have groups like the Style as well. I mentioned the Bauhaus a number of times, and the ABC group, and as representing radical functionalism. So, and we have key manifesto projects in these early stages. Those projects are, you know, they could use any program. For instance, the Haus Schröder by Gerhard Rietveld in the early 20s, or a lot of the early Le Corbusier villas, they are manifesto projects. It's not that modernism was particularly interested in designing villas, far from it. It was just the first projects these protagonists could get hold of. And then at that point, it was more about making a statement about the possibilities of future architecture, a new concept of space. In this case, the new category of modernism was basically understanding architectural design as space making, a very, very abstract term, which really freed up the space of imagination and could interface with abstract art. So you have to look at the Rietveld house, Haus Schröder, not really so much at this point caring about and shouldn't be judged by the particulars of how it solves pragmatic issues and problems and generates the conditions for a good life for the Schröder family. The real kind of significance and purpose of this project was to show possibilities of space making, which were much larger than that. So you can put the Haus Schröder and then next to a speculative exploration like Kiesler's Cité Spatiale. So it's the spatial city of Kiesler is basically that the same kind of new spatiality of planes sliding past each other, no closed volumes, continuously open flowing space, abstraction, you don't know where is bottom, top, left and right, where there's no distinction anymore with base and roof. So this kind of abstracted conception of space was configured, was talked about in manifestos, was configured in drawings, in a lot of theoretical projects, of course. And in the outer purpose of architecture, drawings could be as potent as completed buildings. And again, as I said, these buildings maybe have a life in real society, the family Schröder in the neighborhood. That's not so much what we're considering. These projects are communications within the discourse of architecture, in this case, an avant-garde discourse. And to some extent, you could say this reoccurs. So if you look at deconstructivism, or let's say our early work, Sardine Architects, the Vitra Fire Station is a manifesto project like that, where it's not really, we know that a regional, a local fire station only serving a particular factory in some kind of Swiss village isn't the most important problem architecture can tackle. But the point was, we would take any job to express a new sensibility of space making and architecture. So similarly, if you look at sometimes architects use their own personal house. You know that Frank Gehry's private house is such a manifesto, and he kind of maybe suffering the inconveniences potentially which come along with living in a manifesto project. Similarly, the New York 5 and Eisenman's houses. So architectural research, I mean, and some of these prototypical manifesto constructions, they're also on a form of architectural research. And let's say in recent years, we had the pavilion. The pavilions was the vehicle for a lot of that. And as we know, these pavilions don't have a real function. Their function is discursive and explorative. So architectural research, thesis 8 in this case, the avant-garde segment of architecture functions as the subsystem within the autophysis of architecture that takes on the necessary task of architectural research by converting both architectural commissions and educational institutions into substitutes, vehicles of research. So in architecture, in our discipline, we don't have such a formalized R&D departments and firms. I mean, we do now. Once we have these really large companies with several hundred or thousand people, firms like Zadid Architects and Foster, very, very few firms have that. They have, you're building up research departments with multiple research groups, etc. That's an exception. All the way up to this point, research was done. We converted basically teaching at institutions into research vehicles and places where the avant-garde foments, and places, you know, this was very strong, of course, at the Bauhaus, and then, but during modernism later on, architecture education, like everything else, was more routinized, became really training and rollout of what has been discovered and developed at the Bauhaus. And then they were more technically oriented, really learning a mature discipline. Like modernism in the 50s, 60s wasn't really so much avant-garde, most of it. So we had to, in the 70s, late 60s, 70s in particular, for instance, the AA, the Architectural Association, became that hotbed for generating new avant-garde movements. And that was only possible because it wasn't a normal, it escaped the normal education system where you have set curricula, where you have professors with particular disciplinary sub-disciplines, alignments, what they have to teach, what they have to test, etc. And you have that idea of a unit system where each unit is led by an aspiring avant-gardist who would then use those students, and the idea of an educational institution becomes something totally different, namely a laboratory of avant-garde design research. So, and some clients become the unwitting vehicles of ambitions that are larger than the particulars of what the client is calling for. And so there's an element of abuse, both of its educational agendas and students, as well as of clients, and anything, well, let's say the urge to innovate and research and develop an avant-garde, new avant-garde style by any means necessary, let's put it this way. So this picks up a bit on what we discussed yesterday. So new styles, paradigms, design research programs, I mean, that's the way I'm thinking about new styles, emerge initially via individual works without full individual or collective self-consciousness, and are later reflected upon and formulated in theoretical treatises, manifestos, or programmatic articles. And so sometimes you also have programmatic articles leading, but they're not necessarily yet announcing a style, but there's theoretical articles, works, and then there is, as the currencies and influences spread throughout the field, as a few years later, there's a moment maybe of summarizing that. So manifestos rarely initiate a new style, but rather formalize an already emerging style. These kind of, in this sense, all manifestos are retroactive manifestos. So the example of that would be something like Philip Johnson's, I mentioned that, book, International Style and Exhibition at MoMA, summarizing a decade of modernist design development, if you like, and formalizing, canonizing that style for further dissemination across America. Similarly, you could say that Charles Jenks, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, and the coining of the phrase postmodernism through Jenks, you know, if you think about it, postmodernism started with, you know, in the mid to late 1960s through people like Robert Venturi and many others. So this is also, you know, if you think about it, it's exactly 10 years after, for instance, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. We have the formalization of postmodernism, which then takes off and has another maybe 5-10 years. But already a few years later, in the early 80s, you start seeing things which 10 years at the end of the 80s were summarized as deconstructivism. In, again, some kind of manifesto on show at MoMA. And it's fascinating to see that, and quite strategic, of course, that Philip Johnson was instrumental in his very youth of establishing modernism through MoMA into the US and the larger world. I think that show was 1931 or 1932, and then nearly 60 years later, 1988, it's again Philip Johnson at the end of his life. He lived on a few more years, by the way, and showed up at Beecher Fire Station opening in '93. But he inverted commas did it again with the deconstructivism show at MoMA. So I don't move on to this idea of styles as design research programs. So I was hinting at this, and I showed the tableau yesterday that the category of style in architecture takes up the equivalent place to the category of paradigm, that the category of paradigm occupies, and the role it plays within the systems of the sciences. So the system of architecture and the design disciplines, style occupies that place, and obviously is quite a bit of an older concept compared to the concept of paradigm. But the comparison between what paradigms do in the sciences versus what styles are doing in architecture and design disciplines has been quite productive. So that's something I've developed in the volume 1, and I particularly looked at, I mean, the concept of paradigm was pushed by Thomas Kuhn, realizing that the development of architecture, of the sciences, of the various scientific disciplines, isn't just a smooth accumulation of insights and knowledges, a growth of knowledge, which is just a pure, smooth, linear trajectory, across decades and hundreds of years. But he realized that there are these rifts, that there are scientific revolutions, and that's in the title of his book, and that these revolutions mean that a certain conception of the problematics, certain conceptions of how one works on solving some of these problems shift. There are problem shifts, there are paradigm shifts. And that happens because there's a certain exhaustion in a paradigm, and it doesn't progress further. There's a lot of anomalies and unexplained phenomena coming up, etc. And then there's a search for other ways of framing. Maybe we're looking at or asking the wrong questions. We need to look at other ways of tackling issues and conceptualizing issues. And there's usually a period of paradigm search where a lot of philosophy comes in, etc., etc. And so Kuhn is already distinguishing between normal science, I think what he calls revolutionary science or periods. And I'm talking about the differentiation between cumulative periods, and Kuhn also recognizes that there's these cumulative, within a paradigm, you can go away and beaver at solving all these problems, and you don't have to question fundamentals. You share across the scientific community the conception and goals, and you have a paradigm as a set of rules and principles and methodology, but also a paradigm means great exemplars of good, successful science you can look at and emulate. There's a kind of two meanings to the concept of paradigm. So the second one, which is, I mean, the first one, the rules and principles and values by which you identify concretely in a particular period how to, what are the conditions and criteria for developing truth and probable theories versus false and implausible theories. So this idea I've incorporated because it's evidently there in architecture that you have these cumulative periods, several hundred years of the Renaissance, and then you have it doesn't continue. You have new challenges, you have transitional styles, like humanism, for instance, and then leading into the Baroque, which is quite distinct and different set of agendas and set of also formal principles as work, etc., etc. So I think that makes a lot of sense in architecture too. But I moved on. So Kuhn was important, Popper was important, but mostly Henri Lakatos is the one who developed this more systematically. Kuhn was more writing a history of, and an interesting and polemic history with full of new concepts of the sciences. And Lakatos was taking these concepts and made a new rational system of explaining and guiding the sciences. It's called the methodology of scientific research programs. So he uses a different phrase for basically what Kuhn called paradigms. Lakatos calls research programs. And so that's the phrase I picked as well. And when I'm saying my thesis is styles are design research programs. So now and in Kuhn you find, in Lakatos you find the concept of heuristics, and in particular the articulation into both positive and negative heuristics as key aspects of a research program. So that's the way you define the research program, by specifying these heuristics, meaning ways of progressing the scientific enterprise. So just let me read this. A research program / style, that's now my writing, based on Lakatos, consists of methodological rules. Some tell us what paths of research to avoid. These are the negative heuristics, and others what paths to pursue, the positive heuristics. The negative heuristics formulates strictures that prevent the relapse into old patterns that are not fully consistent with the new approach. And the positive heuristics offers guiding principles and preferred techniques that allow the work to fast forward in the new direction, let's say. The defining heuristics of Parametricism are fully reflected in the taboos and dogmas of contemporary avant-garde design culture. So what I've noticed when I started writing about Parametricism I first talked about it in 2007 at the Advanced Geometry Conference, but then I wrote about it and then the Venice Biennale 2008 with the Manifesto, and then the big article in AD 2009. So what I had noticed by the time was that this avant-garde had been stable for quite a long time, maybe nearly 15 years, and that it deserves to, and that was for me very, let's say, surprising, because I had lived through all these quick shifts from style to style and several parallel styles. Like I said yesterday, deconstructors, minimalism, postmodernism was still lingering on, and neoclassicism, the old modernists, Foster Rogers, the high tech was also still around. We had the panoply and new things cropping up like deconstructivism, etc. So that was, deconstructivism was kind of faded quickly. But after they announced that a few more years before we moved on to something new. When I'm looking back, wow, this is 15 years of, and a particular look at DRL at that time was over. We just had celebrated 10 years of DRL a year earlier, and I said, wow, we actually haven't. It's the same things we're pursuing, the same headlines, the same values, the same slogans, the same theories, the same pursuits, just better and better and better, and across more domains, tackling new issues within the paradigm, constructability issues, planning issues, resolving openings within these continuous envelopes, tessellations, etc. So we moved a little bit, we didn't go back to debating fundamentals. So we shifted away from reading and debating Deleuze to learning, the DRL library shelf filled up with the software manuals, and and we were more about working it through. We did, there was nothing. It was all working out well. No point to debating fundamentals, as it were. So that was interesting. So I said, wow, this means something. I mean, 15 years. I mean, that's like 1920 to 1935 in terms of modernism. We are really onto something here. And also the movement had grown and it expanded. And it really made a lot of progress. So that's when I started to reflect back. And then also seeing that what I then formalized, the heuristics of parametricism, I would have claimed that in the 15 years, what we had at DRL, but also a lot of colleagues and friends, whether it's at Columbia University or works also within the office, studied architects, or the works of Greg Lind and many others, they had been adhering strictly with a series of principles and prescriptions, inverted commas, implicit, which I'll come to, without exception. So that's why I was and increasingly without further debating them, because we're taking for granted that this is valid. That's why I call them dogmas, and also avoiding certain things which, without further debating, just dismissing options. That's why that we had a lot of taboos and dogmas. Sounds irrational, but I think there's a rational kernel to that. Anyway, but the other thing which was very important, and I mentioned yesterday, formal and functional heuristics. So in line with architecture's lead distinctions of form versus function, there are two sets of heuristic principles that define an architectural style. Functional heuristics, principles that guide the interpretation of the brief and the functional elaboration of the design. Formal heuristics, principles that delimit the formal repertoire and guide the formal elaboration of the design. So here we come, I mean, I've talked about it a long time before, but basically the negative principles. So the formal heuristics initially we'll talk about, and that's the internal reference in the distinctions form versus function. So these are important. I mean, there are not only taboos and dogmas, but they're also tools of criticism and project development, and I'll explain that in a minute. I mean, the negative are not so much tools. They're tools of criticism. Stop that. And the positive ones are, tools of project development. More of that, please. So negative principles: no rigid forms. And that means particularly no these Platonic forms, no circles, no squares, no simple rectilinears or triangles, which before all architecture was composed of, even modernism. I mean, we need, in terms of, if you look at Le Corbusier's, sketch of the great simple forms playing in the light as this kind of definition of architecture, which was the cube, the sphere, or half sphere, or triangle, the roof or pyramid. And these obviously have been fully dismissed, and nobody has been using them for 15 years within the movement. So they're definitely a taboo. No simple repetition. That's something you find in classical architecture, but in particular in modernism. And yeah, that's taboo. For 15 years, a whole generation has never worked that way. And the big one, which was the polemic, which established basically Foldism, for instance, against deconstructivism and the idea, for instance, of collage city, and against postmodernism. No collage of isolated, unrelated elements. Because that was very rampant before. Before that, and the kind of period of deconstructivism we did, yesterday I was talking about this superposition, but also about collaging and intersecting and aggregating disparate elements, building up complexity this way. That was right before and up to, and then afterwards never touched. That's a unrelated element. And if we remember the crits, let's say at the AA or Columbia, I mean, I came back to 98 to teach at Columbia, for instance, or we had this kind of group circulating and discussing works. the continuous critique of any project was, this is too much collage. You're collaging, you're just collaging, you don't integrate, resolve, resonate. I mean, that mantra for 10 years was the sharpest critique, because on the one hand, you wanted to build up complexity, and then you also wanted to avoid this idea of collage. So, I mean, I don't know if some of you were around at the time, probably not. It was a continuous mantra. Stop collaging. You're just collaging. This is just a collage. This was this was a killer argument against a project. Okay, so positive principles. And so these were absolute taboos. And there wasn't anymore the argument why you shouldn't do collage. It was simply, don't do collage. Of course, these arguments had been had. And there is reasons and articles explaining the problem and deficiencies of collage. I mean, I wrote a lot of those as well. But largely for a lot of participants, they were just taboos. And that's good enough. If there's somewhere a reason you could look up or rely on, and there is a rationalization somewhere, but you don't have to know that and read that. You just can help a lot. You can do a lot for the discipline by just following and just picking up the heuristics, even if you don't understand necessarily why this is rational to do so. Why this is, you just follow the crowd, and that's the potency of heuristics, or what later on stylistic dogmas and taboos, that you can disseminate them without necessarily disseminating the underlying intelligence and reasoning. I mean, of course, it would be nice if that could also be disseminated, and you should try, but maybe that's harder, and you not strictly need to. And by the way, modernism was exactly like this. Modernism was disseminated across the world, and don't think that they all read time-space architecture, by Siegfried Gideon or Adolf Behnes, discourse on the functional building, etc., etc. Okay, positive principles and dogmas. All forms are variable. That's the idea of a parametric primitive, a spline, a blob, a nerve surface, and that means the intelligence in these plastic malleable elements is that deformation is not just done randomly, but forces impacting. It reacts to something. Every action is a reaction, is my phrase to that. So that, and which then carries the information. The deformation carries the information of what has been triggered, what it's responding to. So that's the thing. So that's the primitives. And then, but these primitives, you don't, just to throw a bunch of them around, or a more or less a same size blobs. All systems are differentiated. So you have multiple of these, you generate a system, you differentiate it with some sort of global order, center, periphery, gradients, left, right gradients, double gradients. So concept of gradients here, this differentiation, it could be fast, slow, could be, anyway, there's principles of differentiation, which is perfect because we have parameters and we have variables which we can continuously vary. And that's where a lot of projects, let's say, rested, and that was very innovative and very potent, and usually they looked incredibly beautiful because you have this mathematical principle and an algorithm of differentiation. You can also, this might also be, morphing was a big story, of course, in the mid-90s when that was discovered. Lofting between two different sections and in betweening something which, FOA's building was based on, etc., etc. So all systems differentiate, and then you say, well, you have to really do it to all systems. And you can, when I say this project development, you can do more. You can more radically differentiate and still maintain continuity. There's always kind of, so if there was always saying, no, stop this collage, this is just collage. In every crit, it was, all form is variable, more degrees of freedom to the form, more ways of varying. System differentiation, differentiate more radically, more with more qualitative emergent properties. The more you differentiate and you still maintain continuity, so you can always do more. But the most important one for me, which I've pushed in particular, discussing the superimposition and what it became within parametricism, this is all systems correlated. So, which means the systems, for instance, these subsystems could be occupiable surfaces, and if there is a void here at the edge, then the envelope is another one. They need to respond, and it might not be a totally tight fit. There's some kind of rule-based responsiveness and correlation of the envelope to the occupiable surface, envelope and structure, as well as structure, occupiable surfaces, shading elements responding to external but also to internal conditions. So this is the idea of subsystem correlation, but also in a city or in a multi-use complex, you have the different subsystems. And this idea of correlation is very important, but of course it's perfectly fitted to parametric modeling, where we can script and build up the dependency relationships, where one thing plays off another and corresponds to the parametric urbanism, the continuous surface, and then scripting the which is differentiated in itself with the degrees of slope, and then that's one of the subsystems already, and then you have the urban fabric as a second subsystem correlating and tying back in a dependency, script the dependency relations to that underlying surface, and then you go in, and when you think about the subsystem, for instance, of a network of paths, the way they penetrate the script that, to permeate and flow through the fabric, it's at the same time correlated back to the topography. How you sequence that is, there are different ways of sequencing these subsystems that has an impact maybe on what the outcome is. And the thing is here, in terms of, it's an infinite project, like the differentiation project, because you could always do correlate and register and resonate with more of the systems, also in terms of contextual influences. They could be picked up informing the individual primitives, but also informing and asking the new system to resonate or correlate to that. So, and you can always critique and always say there isn't a sufficient correlation, and that's nearly then also saying these subsystems are too much collage still, they're not integrated enough. But you could also say it's too boring. There's not a sophisticated, it's a very, very tight fit, which is a trivializing. So I'm looking for non-trivial resonances or correlations. And this is an infinite project. And what's good about it, if you have these heuristics, you can always say, okay, go back and work another 2 weeks, work another 3 weeks, come back in a month, and you will have a more heightened, a further differentiated, a further more deeply correlated, so kind of deep relationism, or the phrase I used, or I'm using in volume 2. You can always have these further differentiations and further correlations. And what that does in the end, you also see it and feel it intuitively. The project becomes ever more sophisticated. And of course, it gets harder and harder if you have so many layers already fully inter-articulated. You're bringing something new. It's initially a disturbance, and you also, it's hard to maintain legibility of these, and becomes maybe too complex. And it's hard to weave that in at the later stage. It's each later stage takes much harder to add to. And that's also a sign that these are very evolved, complex, sophisticated designs, that it becomes harder and harder to do more, and that you can always, you see that you can nearly, you can increase and upgrade the design, and wow, you'll sense the intricacy and depth of correlation and embeddedness. And that's very, very different from previous design disciplines. styles where you couldn't really do that much. I mean, let's say, yes, in deconstructivism, it's not hard, you know, to throw in another layer or collage in another fragment is, you know, it's pretty easy. It's nearly what, you know, because you don't have these further ambitions of integration and correlation and maintaining legibility, etc. You just which shows in a little bit that this is a less evolved style. And also it requires less skills. Once you get the neck of a deconstructivist, build up a deconstructivist composition, you're up for the races, and you don't need to learn, you know, sophisticated software or understand. I mean, the other thing is, of course, when we move on to Tectonism, there's a whole set of new constraints. They don't escape that. They're still all forms variable, all systems differentiated, all systems correlated, but the variable and the differentiation is now strongly informed, for instance, by technical rationalities, by, for instance, structural optimization conditions. So they're not just as willful, and they're much more disciplined and rigorous. And also we see that and sense that. And I think we experience that as a nearly kind of an awe-inspiring intricacy. And we sense that there's good reasons, even though we don't fully understand them immediately, we clearly sense that as a very sophisticated, elaborate organism in front of us. It's basically the difference between, you sense the difference between an earthworm and a tiger, for instance, the differentiation, but the integration. And you sense the hyperfunctionality of the one organism versus the, you know, simplicity or, you know, and let's say deconstructivist compositions very soon became illegible, but also they became nearly like heaps of garbage. You couldn't even orient yourself in your own drawing. You go to the bathroom and come back and you don't know where you were drawing. Anyway, so this is what an important point I wanted to make is that project development and project enhancement is nearly limitless, whereas also in modernism, you know, once you've composed and you do ponderated equilibrium composition, you know, there's no further, you say, okay, I'm done. I can do more, no more. And in the Parametricism project, you can always do more. And that's why also what I find, I mean, that the later versions, the more mature versions, where the teams have skilled up, where the tools are better, where the widespread you know, rationalization and integration of information-rich environments, etc. You see the maturity. There's really more. Actually, we perceive them also as more beautiful, and actually, we have to learn to perceive it as more beautiful, so that we recognize the sophistication intuitively. That's the aspect which I'll come to later. That's the aspect of aesthetic values. So the negative principles on the functional heuristics, and that's the alignment, I think, which is important. And there's also what we discussed, no fixed program stereotypes, right? But instead, all functions parametric or parametrically variable event scenarios. So in terms of a brief, we don't like that these kind of schedule of accommodation with 5 conditions. That already was, you know, we discussed Chumi, you know, close programming, but also Chumi. You don't have to take routine labels for granted. You know, there are things like he's been saying, like you have to understand this piece of architecture, you have to throw somebody out of the window. Maybe it's an extreme existentialist sense, but you have to discover what you know, social meaning of certain spaces is, and it's not coming out of a stereotypical menu. So no fixed program stereotype, no social homogenization. I mean, the modernism was, you know, universal industrial man, as it were, house for the minimum existence. The house for the minimum existence was industrial worker. You have actually that universal consumption standard, the equalization of all lifestyles, everybody 9 to 5 routine with the house, washing machine, car in the yard, and packaged holiday and industrialized food menu. And anyway, so we always had these generic universalizing tasks. You know, and that's why the industrial city of Le Corbusier could be solved relatively quickly. I don't want to trivialize it, but you know, the housing district with the housing solution repeated endlessly. That's social homogenization. The business district, all businesses and all employees the same, and then the logistics district and the production district. Anyway, so that's ideas out. And the other thing is that what I said earlier, these districts, this segregative zoning, which was an absolute discovery and principle of modernism. I think what is great about the modernist city, before you had basically, before modernism, what you had in terms of architecture, you had one, I mean, construction, and the narrowness of the formal repertoire was determining a lot. So basically, all social institutions had to be fit into a preconceived, more or less, symmetry and proportion kind of villa palace model. The city was more or less, let's call it, maybe it was a slightly stratified or center periphery organization, but ultimately segmentary differentiation, everything was more or less repeat. In medieval city, it's just repeating the same house. No zoning in that sense. I mean, visible, maybe there were certain trades in certain streets, but there wasn't registered because there was only one building type, which was relatively treated or ordered into a concentric center periphery hierarchy. No zoning. So and what is striking about the idea of zoning and modernism, the way it then translate, you can then specialize. So separation, specialization, and then repetition. So what is striking about the modernist city is that the business district has a type, the extruded Cartesian towers, which is radically different from the residential, which is these courtyard, open courtyard, or slabs. So you have the zoning comes with it specializing the type for the zone, and then something very different again, let's say in the logistics, the factory districts, for instance. So that was very striking. But that life is gone. I mean, we have mixed use and integration, living, working, entertaining, education, all coming together. So these are the taboos. And this is not only the taboos of Parametricism, these are actually had become taboos also already of postmodernism, of deconstructivism. And what I'm saying here is, anyway, is this, that postmodernism is already showing the end of modernism and the search for something new. So we all knew what the new selection criteria were, what the new, let's say, programmatic social functionality taboos were. And then we went through how they're going to express that formally. Postmodernism, collage, or deconstructivist, abstract, layering in collage, or this, all functions parametrically variable event scenarios. And in the end, that's the way we, instead of having labels, I'm actually now saying, okay, let's develop the parameters of the event. How many people, how many different types of people, how many actions and interactions and connections. You make these agent-based models. They become ultimately parametric. Agent-based models become the registration of the programmatic components or spaces. All program domains, the larger domains, let's say, if you have, let's say, in Le Corbusier, it was the business district, or in a building which was exactly like this, the Bauhaus building, for instance, Gropius, this was the workshop zone, this was the classroom zone, this was the administrative zone. They all look radically different, different height, different depths, different window formation. But then internally they were all repetitive. No, instead of, yes, we distinguish these domains, we differentiate them. So not all classrooms the same, not all offices the same, not all business buildings the same, all domains differentiated. And that means, remember the formal heuristics. And that makes a lot of sense with contemporary society. And then everything communicates with everything else, correlates. So we need to, and also these differentiated domains are not remain separate, they actually interpenetrate. Social interpenetration, social superposition was what I was talking about yesterday. Everything communicates with everything else. Okay, so I hope that is clear enough. And you know, the endless form of nature, it looks across all the design disciplines very, very rich and diverse, but also you immediately see, you can sense this is for sure, none of this is mechanical modernism. It's like you recognize organic versus inorganic nature, you recognize parametricism against everything else. Doesn't mean that it's the same. They are very different. Okay, so then the next topic I have to touch on is this correlation or this alignment and relation of the emergence of architecture on the one hand, as well as the progression of architecture through epochal styles with socioeconomic epochs. So what I call tradition-bound building is basically the medieval vernacular. And it's only the Roman, it's not Romanic, it's Romanesque. That aligns with feudalism. And then you start to see the end of feudalism, the transition, rising cities, which became the city-states of early capitalism during the Gothic. But the Gothic isn't really architecture yet, quite frankly. So because there's no architect named, no authorship, no claim, no originality in terms of individual authors. And also these cathedrals have been built over several, they've gone through many chief masons, if you like. And also the client was more in charge of the project than any kind of what we might discover as, let's say, the chief mason or the masonry troupe, construction troupe. There was no distinction between design and construction. There was no authorship, no writing. So that's why I don't call it architecture. And a lot of times it was the clergy, for instance, who were in charge of running and guiding the construction of the cathedral. So, but since it's been such a fantastic, emergent, sophisticated form of construction, it hurts my heart to not call it architecture. But it comes into architecture once we, as architects, as a conscious theory-led discourse, look back and explain its principles, and then it becomes art part. So all these Gothic cathedrals are now in the domain of architecture, not because they were by themselves, but the artifacts themselves. Now we analyze them and learning from them. And Philip Bloch learns from the Gothic, then this indirectly becomes into architecture finally. But or similar when Achim Menges learns from the vernaculars of this world in terms of their evolutionary, what they've discovered through purely evolutionary process, not through a discursive conscious process, mainly the various adaptations to local climates and allowing for passive systems to deliver certain levels of comfort in quite diverse climates. These morphologies and material logics and also settlement structures. Frei Otto was researching the rationality of these. These were kind of bottom-up emergent evolutionary processes. The results of those now coming into architecture only through scientific reflection within the theory of architecture. But then architecture really starts with the Renaissance, early capitalism, the city-state, the Baroque, and then these transitions, the big epochal styles. It's important that they track somehow major momentous transformation in the socioeconomic system, political economy system of these, not the whole globe, but that, but spreading across most of Europe and then let's say the Western world initially and then globally. Modernism is fully global. You have modernism in Africa, in Asia, in of course in Russia, and literally everywhere. So here we are fully, we're beyond Western phenomena. It's a totally global phenomenon. But anyway, the Baroque is mercantilism, absolutism, neoclassicism, historicism, which 19th century is bourgeois capitalism and the nation states, laissez-faire. Modernism is Fordism, international socialism. Concentrated, highly concentrated capitalism. And Parametricism is global post-Fordist network society. That is incredibly important to remember. Then you can also not expect a new epochal style to be generated without external conditions. Subsidiary styles, yes, they can be generated, maybe also through technological innovations which come in and shift in the same. Subsidiary styles work with the same external societal framing. So I've just actually, yesterday we hinted at this. I was asked the question, but I have passive styles, active styles, and reflective styles. Passive styles is, for instance, the Gothic, because it's not self-consciously pursued. There's no discourse, no discussion. It's retrospectively classified, and that goes also when you retrospectively classify different the styles of different cultures. Active is then, yes, the Renaissance is an active style, because you have conscious discourses, treatises, authors showing innovative work. Look what I've done, radically new, and calling out and proselytizing for their innovations and making arguments. So and many of them influence each other, and they form that movement, which I call as an active style, but it's not yet reflective, because they don't have the category of style, and they don't call themselves the Renaissance. That comes later. It's imposed later. But there is a moment. So we have the passive style, unconscious, retrospectively classified. Active, we have these two. We have the active operational, consciously operated principles, values, communication structures. For instance, in the Renaissance, also in the Baroque still. These are active, non-reflective, let's say, styles, and active operational styles. And then we have the active reflective, consciously reflected, explicitly using the concept of style. And styles in the plural. How does this come about? Well, it was the art historians and architectural historians first who looked back at the history of architecture, and also he looked at the world and starting to see and classify and use the concept of style. And then this was picked up within the active protagonists of architecture, not having yet a name for themselves, but operating with the explicit concept of style. And we then had we had these styles, neoclassicism, various other historicism like the neo-Baroque, the neo-Renaissance, neo-Gothic, and there was a discussion of styles, and what wasn't really, the full consciousness comes only in the 20th century, another level of self-reflective consciousness. Yes, there was definitely the concept of style. There was which style should be built. It was delivering the expectation of a future modern style. That phrase could have been used. No, but we didn't know yet how it looked. So it's interesting. It was calling for it. And then in the early 20th century, you have, by the way, of the end of the 19th century, you had obviously Art Nouveau was the one, and Expressionism. You had these manifestos, these movements, which were premonitions or transitional styles into modernism, which is the most active most self-reflective. Obviously, the self-reflection increases continuously. So that's why I'm saying we have to distinguish epochal styles. These are the long-term hegemonic styles that mark an epoch. Transitional styles are those when you realize somehow that there's a new socioeconomic epoch dawning or in the making or has arrived, and architecture is lagging behind. We can do something. We need to do something. In which style should we build now? And that was Art Nouveau in the transition between Art Nouveau and Expressionism, in the transition from, let's say, historicism into modernism, postmodernism and deconstructivism, transitional styles in the transitioning into from modernism into parametricism. Why am I saying this? Well, I mean, postmodernism didn't exist so long. It started as an avant-garde style in the late 60s and so the 70s, but actually building with a certain degree of scale, postmodernism was relatively popular, but let's say, 15 years. Decon was a bit shorter because we quickly moved on to parametricism, but I call now parametricism as maybe 10 years or 12, maybe maximum 15 years, but parametricism, we're already 30 years in, and we have, where are the big postmodernist airports and, you know, big projects and master plans like our Singapore. I mean, Parametricism is way much more mature, many more projects and many more years of consistent development. It certainly is the only viable and new style that is a candidate for a focal style. I can't call it out, it's still avant-garde. And that's what I think, the strange situation to be avant-garde still or not fully hegemonic. That's basically the bankruptcy or the fragmentation and the challenge I put to the discipline isn't actually contributing enough. It is too fragmented, it's unsystematic, it's fallen back into retro styles. You know, you have a lot of schools of architecture that, you know, neo-postmodernism has been rampant in some American schools. I mean, it's crazy. And I'm sure neo-deconstructism is coming along very soon also. And so we're in a very bad state in the sense of not having achieved 30 years in that real buy-in. And I don't require everybody to join, but it's a critical mass of more than the majority, clearly, similar to what modernism have achieved, let's say, in the 1960s. That's what we should be looking forward to. So it's an epochal in waiting, very potent, still avant-garde style, not yet fully mainstream. Subsidiary styles, but also the thing is, of course, within modernism, you have quite a few subsidiary styles, brutalism, but also, you know, metabolism, high tech, etc. Was even in the 20s already had various strands. And I mean, there's no subsidiary styles within, you know, deconstructivism. There hasn't been time for that. Okay. So I'm just this tableau, passive style, active styles, active reflective, epochal, subsidiary and transitional. Eclecticism is an interesting one. One could have maybe classified as transitional. It's more creative, it's more playful, but it's not quite. In Art Nouveau, you know, is a lot of innovation and flourishing of detail, but the typologies, the basic structure of a built volume was very much still connected with traditional. It was very innovative in terms of detail, ornament, but not so compared to modernism, where we have suddenly any proportion and asymmetric composition. I mean, it's very timid. You had the sort of pre-modern era of the Pletchniks and so on, which is Art Nouveau. Expressionism is more radical, but it was just, you know, flights of fancy, let's say. And then you have modernism, functionalism, organicism, rationalism, brutalism, metabolism, high tech, blah, blah, blah. And here we have holism, blobism, swarmism, tectonism. And that's what, you know, and it is real progress. And you have different new ideas, new concepts, the repertoire expands. It's not that we don't use blobs anymore, but it's not restricted to only blobs. They for the subsidiary role. But now we would have the blobs that would be shell and tensile. They would not be just, they would have, you know, tectonic, motivated, global geometry, but also what's beautiful with tectonism, that there's also subsidiary articulations, ribbing, as well as, you know, it's construction, optimization-based tessellations, etc. So there's much more diversity of global form, much more diversity of texturing, articulation, materiality before, and you remember Parametricism also, even in furniture design. We were just milling these molds and then it's a glossy white. That's the end of it. So it's not to dismiss it, but it is relatively simple and primitive compared to where we are now. So that's a real, truly advance. I mean, I hope everybody can agree with that. And since most of, you know, people who always invited back to the Tongji workshops are all operating in the domain of tectonism, I hope that's respected and understood. And you can see it here. Instead of just these white blobs, yes, there is a white surface here, but it's a tensile, you know, very particular a morphology which is always recognizable. And I mean, it's an old slide. When I started talking about tectonism, I'm sure I could do many more slides obviously today, and and the diversity and richness. And for me, importantly, as I said, this is wow, as somebody who needs material and needs textures, morphologies, and articulatory features for the semiological project. That's a real exhilaration, you know. But also, I was talking about discotism, and I call this virtualism. I've called this virtualism, which is basically the work. I don't know what's going on in SciAc now. I think they're going more into politics now. But this is the object-oriented, ontology-inspired, subsidiary style, in my view, of parametricism. I don't want to talk about it in detail now here. So I think I nearly need to come to an end, but I wanted to come to, first of all, there's a series of theses which summarize what I've been talking about now. So I'm saying the lead distinction within architecture and design disciplines. The lead distinction of form versus function defines the discipline and has universal relevancy with respect to all communications in architecture, as the difference between architectural self-reference and architectural world difference. It represents the difference between system and an environment within the system. Then we have the evaluative codification of architecture. All design decisions are evaluated along two dimensions, utility and beauty. Basically, that is shifting into the evaluative mode, not just the categorization of aspects, but operate in terms of evaluative. And then the architectural styles. Architecture needs new styles to streamline the design decision process and to regulate anew in each epoch the handling of its evaluative criteria or code values. That's concretizing, programming, giving particular heuristic specifications to that long-term persistent binary code of utility and beauty. Without the specifications, you can't really use them, because they say, you know, because you don't know how to identify what's useful changes. Styles as research program, avant-garde styles are design research programs. And that's an interesting one. They start as progressive research programs, mature and become productive dogmas, the big rollout, the mainstream thing, and then end up as degenerate dogmas. You know, when the old guard hangs on to what it's been doing and something that new is coming up and they don't want to recognize it and it's getting superseded. I mean, that will also happen to parametricism. I think we are in a strange limbo of progressive research programs in the avant-garde, or arrested in the avant-garde. I was always hoping to become that mature, productive dogma where I don't have to keep arguing and lecturing before anybody is, you know, recognizing that the principles of parametricism and heuristics are rational and and then you can just run with it in the mainstream. Anyway, so I just want to end off with hinting at what this lecture would have been about: the rationality of aesthetic values. So aesthetic values encapsulate condensed collective experiences within useful dogmas. The inherent inertia implies that they progress by a revolution rather than evolution. So basically you have utility and beauty. Beauty marks the aesthetic value. And what is important here to realize that, so utility is something where we, in the discourse, where we refer to the category of utility, we are called upon to, through analytic reasoning, to explain how it performs and is useful. So that's the analytic deliberative application of the code, the evaluative decision guidance. And the category of beauty is the intuitive, trained up, based on pattern recognition. It's basically the neural network black box identification, hopefully and ideally of the same design option, validating the decision which is underpinned by utility arguments, by beauty arguments. Sometimes we have to oscillate, and sometimes we don't have time, and most of the time we don't have time to continuously rehearse and analyze every step. We just have to follow the black box neural network supercomputer up here, who has been trained up and conditioned with the right and correct aesthetic value. It's not something you can pick up in your sleep. That's the idea. So the absolutely rational is not contrasting, as I said, I hinted at yesterday, that beauty gets in the way. Well, old, nostalgic predilection and preferences and tastes get in the way with current utility concerns. So if there's a contradiction, you know, you have to actually upgrade your taste regimes. But it's not inherently, actually, a lot of times you're relying on, I mean, look, I mean, how could you, if you, it's the same in a social space. There's a pattern recognition when who you talk to. It's also fashion, recognizing who is a contemporary person, who is an open-minded person who would fit with me. You look at the dress code, you look at their hairdo. These are all aesthetic semiologies, all design elements, and you intuitively navigate. You have to. You can't just Google everybody before you talk to them or analyze what they're saying and they're professional. You will also get to that. So we're absolutely relying on, that's the same with during the design process and in a debate, in a crit situation. I mean, of course, you can then challenge like, well, wow, okay, what's beautiful about it? And then you elaborate, and then you realize when you elaborate, well, what is beautiful about it is actually that this kind of level of integration, the level of differentiation. You refer to the formal heuristics, and I say, yeah, I see that, but why should I find that beautiful? Then you switch over to the functional heuristic and say, well, in contemporary society, the default condition is differentiation rather than homogenization of the product of the social audience and so on. So that's better to start here. Then we can discuss a specific differentiation where we have to bring in utility. We can't only rely on beauty, because in beauty we categorically get the right kind of condition. Let's say differentiated and correlated one, but the specifics of can we do more and do more specifically differentiating to align more with the particulars of that social audience and the correlations which are more important are emphasized. Then we have to go into discourse of utility. So just to recap a few words. So, and that's why aesthetic values change, idealized beauties change, because the conditions of life, which morphologies, which phenomena represent the functional. So ideas of beauty in societies where always operating at the verge of starvation, voluptuous and fat people are considered to be kind of positive, a lot of positive connotations. A big king likes to be painted in its full volume, and that makes no sense in the contemporary era, for instance. I mean, that's obviously, so there's an underlying rationality of learning the right, taste, and that's why you need these kind of artists, for instance, coming in, or protagonists who push, revalue all values, as Nietzsche is called, where you have to have aesthetic revolutions, where you show that what used to be, what would have been considered ugly is now the beautiful, and was considered beautiful now has to be dismissed as the ugly. For instance, the pristine simplicity and elegance and seriality of a modernist building becomes, 20 years later, a horrendous, oppressive monotony. The industrial city becomes that ugly monster. Anyway, so that's, it puts the veil of the beauty, the mystery of beauty, and aesthetic values, they align with the formal a prioris often of any style. Formal a prioris, in a sense, are, as another phrase for the formal heuristics, but every architect has that, their preferred ways of starting a design, the kind of elements that they use without thinking. They're not selected based on critique and analysis. They're just a prioris. And I was talking yesterday about OMA having a lot of a prioris, which are, a prioris means that you don't discuss them and critique them anymore. They're dogmatic. I mean, that's okay if after a full critical debate, collective debate of 1 decade, let's say we had a full critical, theoretical, probing debate and experimentation in the avant-garde style of Parametricism, and then maybe you don't have to spend all that time and energy on reconfirming the conclusions of that debate, and you can take them for granted, and then you bring up a few set of students. There's a bit of a danger here, but they just, you know, they become dogmas. It's all important that should they be challenged, we can go back and rehearse. And maybe you should also teach your generations that they hopefully they read these some of these articles, but they're no new articles really. You know, why should you revisit the same questions 100 times? So you end up with these dogmatic formal a prioris. The necessity of aesthetic revolutions, it's basically similar to the historical transformation of aesthetic values, but also aesthetic values in the end, firstly in the avant-garde style, it's the designers' aesthetic values. How do they select the next step? How do they develop their project? What do they imitate and go by and appreciate? But in the end, that goes into end users. End users have to pick up those and find, or say, hey, this is a cool building. I want to work here. And I suspect that the best and brightest are also selecting these are the contemporary figures. This is going to be functioning well. I'm going to be happy here. End users have to, and I'm not going to go into this kind of modernist, you know, bunker. I'm going to this beautiful, open and differentiated and lively and rich, etc. Parametricism university building. So end users have to also learn that, and we all have that. We all not only aesthetic values are not only, and that's a belonging to the discourse of architecture and designers. They also belong to everybody. We all live by aesthetic values. And the final word, I can't elaborate here, order versus chaos as universal across historical aesthetic regimes. I've sometimes said, like, wow, okay, are these aesthetic regimes all the ones which continue, which you put next to each other, the winning epochal styles and the aesthetic regimes, is there something which a red thread, which all of them have something? It's not only that the new one turns the old one into pure ugliness. No, that the ugly is maybe the visual chaos. Order versus chaos is maybe a universal thread, but the conception of order is becoming ever more rich and complex, and adapts contemporary conditions of ordering, which are not necessarily easy to observe, and they might appear disorderly. And that's what I'm sometimes look at the contrast. If you read Le Corbusier and compare the for Le Corbusier, the donkey's path or the medieval town was ugly, was disorderly, didn't see the order. He said the human order is the axis and the grid. And Otto said, well, no, there is actually hidden evolutionary evolved order in the medieval pattern. The donkey path is the path of least resistance up the mountain, is actually the intelligent path, rather than asking the donkey to go in a straight line. So there is, so recognition of more subtle and complex orders is then developing the new ideal of beauty, and the chaos is that randomness, is that disorderly, that which aligns with the dysfunctional. So maybe we can have that red thread, or maybe across the variations, the variable moment of the aesthetic ideals and heuristics, there is an underlying red thread or a constant, which is this distinction order versus chaos. So I leave it at here. Sorry, I went a little bit longer, but I had to pack in. I had to finish the big topic of styles, and also wrap up the idea of aesthetic values, so that they can still work, lecture on what I had planned for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay.
Wait, okay, here. Stop sharing.
It seems today is the most important for parametrics.
Yeah, they're getting longer and longer.
Yeah.
I hope there's enough time for discussion.
Yeah. At the very beginning, I imagine it should be like it's in the first or second lecture of this part, and then we're looking forward to see what's the next. But actually,
well, I was thinking, I mean, I could talk more about civil society, but I was thinking tomorrow I might talk about art. my
Okay,
theory of
great.
art. I might switch. I might change.
I think it's super important, actually, to the academic theory, contemporary theory, because just like Peter Eisenman, when we talk about the architectural history in last century, we can never skip Peter Eisenman, his contribution to the,
That's right.
the academic, right, academic theory. And I think similar to parametricism, that's a very important part in the contemporary architecture theory. I think today you actually analyze the manifesto, or the most important you mentioned as the epical styles in the history after the modernism, and analyze different small transitional or subsidiary styles, which also parallel with parametricism over the past 20 years. I think it's interesting to us. I think something should be proved by history. That's why
absolutely.
Today or this year, you actually gave a review to the parametricism. And also we want to upload all these files, not only in Bilibili, but YouTube's. I think these platforms will be important as as a knowledge system. When we teaching different courses, the professors can also assemble all these theories in their lectures or in their courses. So that's why I think we invite you coming here to make this the sequence of the lectures. So I think Chao, would you like to asking some question? I think a lot of interesting part, including some transitional styles or the subsidiary styles of parametricism, which happening over the past 10 years, because we experienced that part, including the Tectonism and including the discretism, and including a lot of avant-garde or practitioners or professors. They actually engage in this process. So we can make a discussion on that. So welcome. Maybe Chao, would you like to put forward some questions first?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think, well, finally we get into Tectonism. I really want to ask some questions, but I think maybe the first is, well, to some extent we can interpret like Tectonism is about how the semiological, phenomenological model of parametricism synchronizing with the engineering logic of structural environment and construction. But I think most importantly, I think structure and construction is more kind of crucial here, because it's directly from both historical and contemporary context, we can understand structure and construction is directly associated with human perception through empathy to create a kind of phenomenological connection between the subject and the space. But in the end, I think both parametricism and Tectonism is more about construct the communication system between the end user and the space. So my question is how you, well, at some point we still need to differentiate the semiological model and the phenomenological model of this parametricism in the context of Tectonism. So my question is how you would differentiate these two when we're saying when we're treating the architectural space as a kind of communication system. Patrick, you are muted.
Sorry, I just had muted myself. There's some background noise here. So yeah, I mean, well, thanks a lot for the questions. Very insightful. And yes, structural engineering and issues of construction, materiality feed in strongly with the global form, articulation, factura elements. But I think the environmental is also of interest to us. I put on the same plane because that might be enveloping, shading, perforations, the differentiation of that, but then particularizing it. It also has a lot of chance to communicate indirectly, not directly intended. For instance, you can communicate through the differentiated envelope where is west, north, east, even on an overcast. And it's something that unifies a whole series of buildings. Overshadowing of a building onto facade, you can then open up the windows there if it is at a critical part of the day, and that would resonate or would in a sense represent the context on the facade, things like this. But we have also some nice buildings which where the environmental engineering element is not the only one. There's also construction and structural. But for instance, CBD, the Central Bank of Iraq, is one of those projects which is strongly in its manifestation and also in its function as landmark, designed through shading and orienting the building, very radically different transforming faces. Or the Riyadh project, the King Abdullah Energy Research Center. So I do find this also interesting, and I'm mentioning this because particularly if you're trying to work with passive systems, they have a strong impact on the morphology. So they will also become visible, they will become inadvertently iconic, communications of something special. And so I think that should also be included. And there's something which is also obviously, there's a lot of pressure on the discipline to respond to that, and Parametricism, Tectonism can strongly respond in its unique way to the environmental challenge, whereas no other style of architecture can. All the other retro styles and architects working within, they can only respond by saying, yes, we've hired the best engineers and we have a very particular recycling machine, or we're using a contractor to do our concrete is all recycled, etc. So that they have no other way to, I want to point that out because again, the superiority, let's say, high performance potency of Tectonism in this respect is also something which we need to note now. Wow, I've lost my thread. But your actual question, can you remind me where your actual question was heading towards? I mean, okay, now I remember phenomenological project versus semiological project. Now that's very important. So, and I hope, look, these are tough projects, and it took me years to build up the sensibility to reading, the learning, the way of working on that, and it's still hard for me to fully. There's some interesting semiological projects in the office, but it's not easy at the speed of a competition to have that very systematized. And I need more help, inverted commas. So that was my particular way of framing that. So Tectonism as a style exists, again, it's part of the movement. Parametricism naturally evolved in that. And most of the key protagonists, ambitious protagonists, moved into Tectonism. And I can describe that. And definitely that is a reality. And in Parametricism 2.0, I have collected a lot of those characters, and they're obviously, we're all familiar with them. And Zardin Architect is one, not through all its works, is in there as well. But the agenda, which I think this transports, and why I love it so much, also not only because of efficiency and engineering, because of semiology, that has not been so much picked up on explicitly, theoretically. Nobody has written that on their banner. Although I think intuitively, that's what I think is also pursued. And intuitively, the semiological project is always, and phenomenological project, I think, is there. So when clients look at works and sketches, they also want to, they critique it if it doesn't bring the right message. And the architect also has an intuitive way of what this building would mean, how it will be perceived, how it is different, and what it, or maybe also when they have different parts in the building that they want them to be a little bit different. They also care about whether easy to find whether the massing represents quite well the breakdown of the institutional parts of the building. So but they also want them fusing, like this is our Baku project, where we can see the library, we can see where the museum is and where the concert hall is. So that's all. That's nearly, and I make that more explicit. That this communication aspect is foregrounded. I think it's there, but unfortunately, it's not fully there. But now coming to so that's my original contribution, and I hope that there's more buy-in, because I really think it delivers a lot, Tectonism, with respect to a semi-logical project. And also it's important, if Tectonism wants to survive into the metaverse, it needs to pick up the social functionality element, which is really truly in our domain, more than the technical aspects, which we are pushed, but ultimately will be now for real big projects. We'll have to bring the engineers on board to do it. And I always felt that when you look at all the Achim Menges pavilions, for instance, there is a thrill about new expressiveness. I mean, it's inherent in our instincts. He isn't only in love with the fact that these are now most efficient, and he's not comparing efficiency between the different pavilions. He just loves that there's so many different expressions and forms, and that there's a new technology. So I think I believe that. And anyway, he is not the engineer in the team. He is the architect driving it, of course, wanting to do. And these are beautifully lightweight and high performance structures, but that doesn't explain the pursuit of quite diverse forms of expression and originality of expression, which I think is a value within our discipline, which really has to be rationalized through the use in the semi-logical projects, I believe. Now, the semi-logical and phenomenological project relate as follows. I mean, you need a semi-logical project needs to have a phenomenologically well-functioning. The phenomenological aspect has to function well, so that this also could pick up the semi-logical function. Why? Because because phenomenology is about perceptual tractability, figure ground identification, identifying different parts, seeing that they're different. If it's not becomes conspicuous, yes, you have different patterns for the different parts, but they look too similar, so phenomenologically they're not becoming differentiated, then they also cannot carry the information. Or if you don't see the entrance at all, you don't see the sign, you don't get the information semilogically. So that's the build-up. There are two aspects we need to work on independently. Problematics, which need to be foregrounded and worked on independently with different criteria of success, but they stack up. That's the distinction here I'm making between the phenomenological and semiological project. I find the semiological project has more importance. That's you solve the phenomenological project in order for them to get on to the semiological project, which has more complexity, more richness, and so on and so forth. And if the message is relatively simple, then the semiology could be simple and the phonology is the main thing, but it's basically legibility in the face of complexity. Legibility meaning perceptual tractability, I should rather say. First solved in the phonological project, and then you go into legibility and understanding socialized messaging in the semiological project. And the semiological project, respects more us as how we perceive, which is actually a human constant, more or less. I mean, it's being researched in the psychology of perception, cognitive psychology, which isn't historically specific, which is a human universal capacity. I mean, I think you can be trained to be better at pattern recognition, and I don't think you can learn to watch a contemporary commercial where things are cut like rapidly. So I think there's a learning, but there's ultimately it's a issue of permanent cognitive constitution, whereas the semiological project is obviously something where it's really, of course, we also have underlying capacities, a linguistic and language capacities, inverted commas, visual language capacity, but the actual you don't have something like the Gestalt grouping principle so easily in the semiological project. There's much more open field of investigation, and I mean, I was trying to push forward that we could bring in new categories and concepts of semiology which aren't in the, let's say, there is something like a spontaneous semiosis where the built environment has some degree of semiological and semantic encoding, but for instance, there's rarely negation. There's no really quantification where you say only some of these elements here are X, Y, Z. So I wanted to bring conditionals, if this, then that. So I wanted to bring some kind of new categories, more sophisticated things like modal logic, conditional logic, things like negation and quantification into the semiological project. I mean, that's a big, tall order. I mean, it's difficult. And it's something we can't do single-handedly, because if that does not happening many fronts, we can do that beautiful, let's say, artifact, but nobody will have much of a chance to understand and learn this. They might, if they live along and repeatedly come, they will realize and make certain connections. But if they ever pick up that there's certain negations operating in the building, maybe, I don't know. So for that, we need a broader, for me, actually, the frustration is a little bit that, yes, Tectonism, of course, is there. I'm just describing it. I'm validating it. That's very important. But the semiological project, which I think is so, where the Tectonism is so strongly required, as I explained yesterday with the Google campus, that the other protagonists of Tectonism didn't buy into this. Partly, of course, because they're doing relatively small things where you don't need that. We are the ones who are doing whole urban districts and big campuses now, for instance, on the competition for Sinovac, etc. A big so we urgently need, we're grappling with semiological differentiation and legibility in complex and urban large scale projects.
Well, yes, I think quite true. I think when talking about the expressionness of the tectonic patterns, it really matters when we work with different scales of projects. I just want for a small question. Maybe after that we go to students' question. In the context of tectonism, when we bring those kind of structural engineering logic or construction logic, in that case, when we think through the phenomenological project, it's not only about visual perception, because through the understanding of those structure, those flowing of the internal forces through the structure, we as subject, we kind of build up a kind of empathic connection or embodied perception of those space. So how you address this in your parametricism of through phenomenological model to get to the semiological model?
Yeah, I actually thank you. That's very nice what you're saying, and embodied perception. I was talking recently a lot with David Kirsch, who has written a lot about that. Yes, I think that's true. I mean, actually, it's a multimodal, and we all sense this. So, I would still say that this is embodied perception is part of the phenomenological project, in the sense that as architects, we should reflect upon what might be an embodied perception, subliminal, grasped, and sometimes, and this is really it. A lot of this perception is obviously an intuitive processing, and we can respond to what we perceive without necessarily making it conscious and pinning a name to it.
Yeah.
But a lot of times what I find fascinating is that any rule-based way of working, where you have dependency relationships, where the differentiation is, for instance, when you know that the structure is becoming more heavy and the joints more momentous at the lower parts of the building and more filigree at the upper part, these are logical differentiations. So then you can also infer, if you have been going up and down with elevator, where you are in the building. Should you have forgotten. But also, as I said, with exterior differentiation, there's a script where, for instance, sky orientation of the building is implanted into the into the rule base, that becomes something it has inference potential. You infer back. Whereas if you make arbitrary decisions, like in a deconstructivist project or in a postmodernist project, that you don't get much inference potential. This is here like this, not because there was a rule, because the architect placed it there for whatever inexplicable reasons, and it doesn't follow. Then it doesn't tell you much. And the other thing is what I find about the phenomenology of, let's say, structures in particular interesting, because the structure is really very, you can't lie about it. It's not like the Eisenman plasterboard semiology. This might be all lies, but structure is there and you trust it. If you see a huge beam, you know somehow that, and maybe that you're in a large room, even if you don't see that because there are partitions and so on, and you can sense where's the center. If these beams have moment connections, then they will also point to the center of the space, which where you don't see maybe the boundaries in some big exhibition space and so on. If you look at the ceiling, the structure tells you a lot. So these are inference potentials, but first of all, then these moment lines, they need to be sufficiently conspicuous. And if you have different ways, for instance, to make that beam adaptive to its moment connections, you can make it thicker and make the flange of the I-beam with a different gauge, like we've done, for instance, in Wolfsburg. They're all different, but you don't notice that. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should make it deeper and quite a bit deeper and hollow out so that the line is more strongly. That would be where you say, okay, the phenomenological project works with the engineering logics, but now we're adding something. We're not letting the engineer do it without interfacing. We guide them and say, hey, I want this to be more perceptible, because I think it marks the center, and that means everybody can orient, and maybe the next level of occupational can play against that. So that's the way the phenomenological project operates and works with the engineers, because there's solutions which are more perceptually tractable and less. It's not an automatic. And I think letting the engineers do stuff, even with new contemporary tools, without that aesthetic control, which is rationalized through the phenomenology and semiological project, they end up, doing something which is probably less legible than it would be. I mean, something will probably come through. Yeah, so that's what I would say with respect to that.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. I still remember in one of your papers, you made a really fascinating argument saying, today the task of tectonic is really to representing the unperceivable kind of dynamic of forces in the complex, sophisticated structural system. That's really really fascinating argument.
Yeah, but you know what I made the distinction so what is curious is there was this idea of some kind of not Tectonism, that the tectonic in architecture is somebody like Kenneth Frampton, and even somebody like Frampton was talking in a phenomenology in a different sense. I have to distinguish my approach quite strongly from both what is usually called phenomenology in architecture, as well as, I mean, not rejecting all of it, as well as something like Frampton's approach in, I forgot this book on the tectonic in architecture. So what is, and also what has been called structural expressionism. So basically the misunderstanding here is tectonic culture and structural expressionism misconceives the audience of the communication that architecture broadcasts into society at large. Because the way they talk about it is a connoisseurship, is internal to the discourse. So they want the structural to be visible so that the engineer can have a didactic understanding of how the structure works. Similar with tectonic, you express the way things are put together. And that becomes a self-referential symbolism within the engineering and sophisticated architectural profession. That's not the way I look at it. Mm-hmm. I look at it as that's not the purpose, because the end user wouldn't care about that. The final, you have to think about the messaging and communicating to the final end users, the occupancy, those who live and work and they need to be oriented. So the message is not, this is an optimized beam and look how the forces flow. The message is, in this direction, for instance, is the shortest span. That opening in the grid of structure, this is Jesse Rice at the space frame, which absorbs where that opening is. That's where the exit is, or here's the center of the space. That's the message. That's useful information. And so what I'm looking for, we instrumental, and that's also in there. These messages are in there, and they need to be focused on and enhanced, and not the didactic of structure, which is self-indulgent. And the other thing with the phenomenology project and people like that Scandinavian guy, I forgot his name, Plasma. People like Plasma and also Frampton, when they talk about the phenomenology project, they want to address all the senses.
Yeah, sure.
And I do like that, but again, they don't instrumentalize it. For me, the sense is like and I have that sense. We have this. So if you come to, let's say, whatever a sculptor would look at the physicality of the world. If you confront a thick steel plate in sculpture or stone, heavy, it gives you a very different feeling viscerally, and that's like multimodal, it's an embodied perception of that rather than a cardboard wall. It's just instinctively, and you feel with the because they contrast to your physical. You are much stronger than the cardboard wall. You could push through that. It doesn't give you a goosebump. But the steel is like your head would just smash against the steel plate like an egg. So you perceive that different, and that we can work with these connotations, different atmospheres, Richard Serra sculpture or space where you have that. Let's work with it, but let's instrumentalize that to distinguish the austere, the somber versus the gay and light social situation, and not just to the connoisseur. The problem is a lot of architecture theorists, they don't think in terms of end user social functionality. They think it's a game of connoisseurship. That I have that thrill. I'm not living there. I'm just visiting. I'm not religious. I don't care about religion, or I just visit Ronson, and I want to have this orgasm of connoisseurship, which is totally irrelevant to how we should critique Ronson. Is not whether we have that connoisseurship organism, and whether we can, smell the timber, and that's the phenomenological experience we deliver. That's not the way architecture. That's why also it's very important. I will talk tomorrow. They're confusing, architecture and art. And for me, these are just instruments. Yes, I want to smell the timber, but I want to smell it as an instrumental differentiation of guiding and hosting and putting, that people associate. I want to use all the senses. Not only visual sense is important, but I've been talking for a long time about the body sense, the vestibular, the sense of balance. And so we're quite perceptive with receptive slope. And you can walk down the steepest slope and guide somebody, or you can walk along a horizontal contour line on the slope, and where you are in the space, and you can use that. It's systematic deployment of slopes. Then you don't need to use visual sense. You can fully let people be guided by their proprioceptive vestibular sense, and then you can still give other information to the visual sense, where the overall orientation is taken care of. Now vision gives you other choices, auditory sense, and the more we can simulate that into our designs, light and shadow, or sound. So that's what I mean. That's the phenomenological project is a highly instrumentalizing all of these experiences for the purpose of upgrading social functionality, because there comes a point where these environments are so complex that we need all the senses, and we're using them now. Sound, where there's something going on here, or here's street noise, that's the exit to the main street. We're continuously doing that, except that no architect is working on that. No, so we're totally losing out a whole dimension in terms of proprioceptive, in terms of smell, even temperature, cool, hot. For me, these are all dimensions of the semiological project. Now, the phenomenologists, they don't like instrumentalization. They want to. They want the experience, which I think is not what people, yes, an architect comes to Corbusier building for that experience and maybe enjoys the humid air in the kind of wet concrete bunker. Well, that's not what end users want.
Yeah,
so it's very differently oriented phenomenology compared to Frampton and also a very different sense of the tectonic. It's not a didactics of, it's not the purpose of this structure is not to explain to structural engineering students or to the general public what a moment connection is.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think I totally agree. I think that's the problem of architectural phenomenology in general sense. That's their nature of the problem is from their nature of anti-theory and anti-instrumentalization.
That's the problem, and then look at the structural expressionism. Some people pursue it, and obviously these remain continuously controversial. They may, because there is something fundamentally wrong with it. It's not always, people not always can put their finger on it. My frustration is, I don't think my approach would be and could be controversial. The problem is more that it's ignored, it's not known, it's not discussed, because it's somewhere hidden in treatises which are not easily penetrable. So that's why I think I'm very happy with these YouTube Billy ways of discrimination. I've recently, I've seen other intellectuals who realize, we are living in the era of YouTube, and if you can't bring it out on YouTube, forget it. Jordan Peterson is one of those guys he was an intellectual with writing books for a number of decades, and then nobody was reading it, and now he's an intellectual star through YouTube. I'm not craving for that, but it is just at a certain point, it's frustrating if the work isn't, the reception and resonance isn't what I think it would deserve. So I hope that the YouTube thing helps.
Okay, well, Daniela, maybe go to your question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. My camera's off. It's awfully early here in Chicago. So just bear with me, this is kind of a long thing. Basically, I'm getting to asking the question about the instrumentality of the metaverse. But what I want to say first is that scientific paradigm shifts occur when proof makes a theory irrefutable. For example, currently top physicists are ejecting Einstein's space-time fundamentals with models capable of absorbing the strange behavior in the quantum world. In architecture, any notion of theoretical proof immediately becomes the object of continuous contentious debate, and proof only comes in the form of hegemonic mainstream adoption, perhaps. As society via digital culture moves towards what Balaji Srinivasan calls the network state, and the immersive web metaverse emerges as a societal communication system that thrives on being what Tubador called a sandbox on steroids for every aspect of society, for example, economy, governance, jurisprudence, urban design and architecture, etc. Can you please discuss your prediction that parametricism will become a hegemonic style in the metaverse? Do you foresee a new subsidiary style when the metaverse becomes manifest in mixed reality urban scenarios? And a more general question, how will the metaverse transform cities? And finally, please elaborate a bit on your current AADRL research in the metaverse.
Yeah, I mean, the later, I mean, what you just mentioned, yes, I expect a new subsidiary style coming through the metaverse Programmatic, particularly because, and I don't think it would only become a full-blown architecture and the design discipline relevant style if it feeds back into the physical design items, which I foresee. I foresee that there's a feedback, for instance, the responsiveness and malleability in AI and robotics environments will feed back into the physical world, but also we're going to have a lot of interaction back, overlays, AR overlays, and windows into virtual worlds within physical spaces. This is what I've been calling the cyber urban incubator. So I do foresee both, yes, the emergence of a new subsidiary style, and that will be a fully fledged style to the extent that it feeds back into the world of design at large. You can see it, fashion design, for instance. I mean, by the way, so parametricism and even Tectonism is applying to all design disciplines. So it's not only architecture. Urbanism, even to some extent, we can make the argument for urbanism. But let's say architecture, of course, it's clear. Interior design, it's less pertinent, maybe less pushing into it, but certainly furniture design. We have a lot of Tectonism, parametricism, Tectonism, furniture design, and including fashion design. I've been trying to work on this because you have all the new technologies of fabrics, of differential fabric weaving, and there's this engineering ultimately. This is, you know, moisture management, there's this movement management. Where is the fabric stiff? Where is it soft? Cooling fibers, and you can express those where they are required. So I foresee, so it's including, I mean, less prominent perhaps graphic design, but I mean, it's interesting to probe where something like parametricism, for sure, in graphic design, I see it. I mean, I see it in the Apple interfaces. When you draw your cursor, the icons swell and disappear. When you click on the window, it swooshes back to place in this kind of swirling movement. That's parametricism at work in the Apple laptop UX, UI design, but is there Tectonism there, which is perhaps less prominent, but I do definitely feel that there's going to be subsidiary style, and I can see certain things which might lead to that, and I'm sure there will be different versions, different ways, and different experiments. The hegemony is certainly not guaranteed, but I think it's much more likely than in the world out there at this stage, and I see it happening. I see a lot of parametricism designs in the metaverse, and not absolutely universal. There's spatial, there's this group at the AA who do a more of a kind of postmodernist metaverse. I think it has no chance. Candy colors and gables and arches, I don't think it will get you very far in the metaverse. So yeah, I'm definitely believing in hegemony. I definitely believe in and it has to feed back, I think, to really become, I wouldn't, you know, I don't think it's sustainable, because yes, there will also be specialists, like there's interior designers not only working in interiors, and there's fashion designers only working there. So there will be also only few metaverse designers. But so far, I think the design disciplines, I mean, that's a hypothesis, but it has been across all design disciplines. So you do have, I mean, even in the Bauhaus, even in the modernism and white modernism was, you know, the reform dress movement was at the very same time as, and there was a functionalist understanding of dress and the privileging of white. And, you know, you have Adolf Loos writing about underwear and dress and you have and sometimes the wives, for instance, of Mies van der Rohe and of Peter Behrens. And you have this, you have modernism and a modern movement across all design disciplines. Of course, I mentioned that many times. Look at Marcel Breuer's Vasilis chair. I mean, if that not a piece of modernist constructivist furniture, but also fashion. So I expect, and that's what I said, it exists in Parametricism across all design disciplines, including graphic design. So I wish that this new subsidiary style Tectonism is also universally across. As I said, my fashion design agenda is Tectonism. I wish I had more fashion designers in my team and had more time to develop. I want to, of course, wear the next iteration. I had my Parametric jacket I'm wearing it. It's a primitive early version. So yeah, I think a great question. I think that, by the way, I have to disagree a little bit with the idea that that paradigm shifts have to do with theoretical proofs or decisive experiments. None of this really happens or exists. These are more accumulations of anomalies and unresolved problems, a certain stagnation, and the burgeoning of new ways and methodologies forward, which are then weeded out to develop a new paradigm. It's not something you can pin down. There's very, very rarely, yes, it seems like, as if that shift in physics from a Newtonian to Einsteinian was depending on a series of crucial experiments. Well, yeah, to some extent that's very exceptional, by the way. So you don't expect that it's not a singular, sometimes it's fast, it's a rapid revolution. I mean, Zheng's always showing let's say the explosion of the Pruitt-Igoe estate in 1972 as the final refutation of modernism. You can make statements like this, but that doesn't mean that has a lot of truth, because that was when Centre Pompidou was started its success trajectory over, and 10 years later you have modernist icons like the HSBC Tower, Foster's, and let's say Foster Rogers high-tech modernism only took off, so it's certainly not the end of modernism.
Can I ask a related?
So they all know these events don't exist, and there is clearly in the philosophy of science, it's been fully recognized, there's neither a theoretical proof of anything nor a final decisive experiment which settles questions. A lot of times it's actually the dying out, literally, of the old protagonists, unconverted figures, and in architecture to some extent, they're actually coming of age and growing up and taking positions and voice of the next generation. So it's also, that really is also a mechanism which underlies paradigm shifts. I mean, of course, there have to be that external in architecture shift, but then it doesn't mean that, I mean, yes, there's a conversion of all young architects in the early 90s, but it doesn't mean that Rogers and Foster never came over, nor did Ricardo Bofill or Michael Graves.
Can I ask a related, or ask you to elaborate on a related thing? So why is the metaverse important in terms of what is happening on the blockchain side? Why is blockchain so important as a project to the metaverse? Like, how do you see that conjunction, like that convergence?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an absolute necessity. You could have a metaverse without blockchain, centralized services competing, and that's obviously what Facebook is trying to do. And maybe Facebook wanted to go into some kind of cryptocurrency also and tie that in. So there's lots of good reasons for it. It's not not necessity. I think it's the permissionlessness. It's the global openness, the escape from government control, etc., which is behind the blockchain. It was also that these trust systems. It's faster. It's more reliable. It's not open to corruption. It allows more modes and models of participation. By the way, they could also exist in corporate world. So there's no, I mean, they have this wonderful exploration of the ecosystem of DeFi and blockchain related entrepreneurship. I mean, whereas in the corporate world, you have one major model of, let's say, this kind of Delaware corporate incorporation, rules of incorporation, and then one very typical system of organizing shareholder collective decision making. All these I mean, that might, so there's no inherent reason why these corporations couldn't become more fluid and invent new forms of internal enfranchisement and decision making and so on and so forth without a decentralized blockchain. At the moment, it's just fascinating that these governance space is so opened up in the crypto ecosystem, and I think that's very, very productive. But the real thing here is permissionlessness, and also the idea of cryptocurrencies, new forms of funding. It's not a necessity; it's a congeniality, and I find it fascinating that a lot of big investors and big technology companies taking the route, even though they could establish them as corporates, they take the route into the blockchain DAO world, because if they think that's where the energy is, that's where the innovation's flowing, and I think that's true. The best and brightest of a whole generation have been aggregating and accumulating in that space. And that's maybe also something which we have to trust, and I want to be part of that too. So I think that the metaverses I prefer to work on are those which are related to the crypto ecosystem or Web3, where this becomes part of the definition of Web3. It's not only the immersive web, it's the web of value, but even the web of value, in a sense, you can say, well, don't we have that? We have PayPal and so on. No, it's more about ownership, titles and ownership conditions in digital assets. These are fascinating things, and they exist in the blockchain first. Doesn't mean that they couldn't exist in centralized systems of trust, but I think they would be more expensive. There's also an economic driver. There's an enormous amount of economy in these trustless and automated algorithmic system. I mean, if you look at the trading going on in a system like Uniswap, it's amazing, and it's just algorithms. It's just technology, and not thousands of staff of investment bankers or lending officers. But of course, you also have to recognize that all the lending is at the moment fully over collateralized, so that's not lending proper. That's for me the next stage, and that's why I thought quite interesting with the Vitalik Buterin and Glenn Weil talk about the DSOC, decentralized society, that they foresee a non-collateralized lending coming through new blockchain-based mechanism, like the idea of non-transferable tokens, credibility and credit. Credential tokens maybe become mechanisms one can rely on to open up non-collateralized lending, which is really the lending you need for funding a lot of entrepreneurship. I mean, other than the generating a new currency for each new project, which I think has also its problems. I mean, the proliferation of exchange markets. I mean, if you're already complaining about, whatever, 50 global currencies and the forex markets being the biggest market in the world, just because we have so many currencies, I don't think hundreds of currencies continuously tracking and exchange rates is necessarily the best way, and that's the only way at the moment that you can fund crypto projects by generating a new currency, which I think is not the best way. So, but I love that space and a trust in its inherent rationality through its fierce competitiveness, and in a space of permissionless exploration. That's why I love it. It's nothing inherent necessarily. As I said, we can imagine metaverses, and it's more contingent also that these corporate metaverses, which Facebook is trying. The problem is the Facebook is so much in, Mark Zuckerberg has to show up in Congress anything he's trying to do something, so they will not be allowed to do much. interesting things. Like they weren't allowed to do a stable coin, but then the others, you know, just did it, didn't ask permission. It's something the big corporates can't afford to do. They're much too much under the spell of, you know, American politics.
Okay, maybe we just take one last question from Mirik. Mirik, would you like to ask the question?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the lecture. So would you say that the avant-garde status that lasts long is perhaps due to the targeted sensibility of globalism? Could we label mainstream as something available to the mass, where the understanding of the influence of style needs to be easily interpreted, integrated, or even related to memory to be distributed?
I'm not sure about memory, but yeah, I mean, basically the avant-garde to mainstream, it should be an ambition of any avant-garde to become mainstream, because otherwise, if it doesn't become mainstream in the sense that retrospectively looked at wasn't actually an avant-garde. Avant-garde means, you know, the spearheading group, who will lead the way. I mean, so in a way, avant-garde is currently, we can recognize it as an avant-garde. Looks like an avant-garde movement, but if the mainstream adoption never happens, then maybe it wasn't actually the avant-garde. If something else takes over, I mean, that's the thing. So for instance, in the modernists, the early modernists, Mies, Gropius, Van der Rohe, and then the protagonists of the Bauers, Hannes Meyer, and many of the other modernists, that was an avant-garde. There were others at the time, you know, like there were still people around, the Frank Lloyd Wright, Pleshnik, the pre-moderns. A lot of what they were trying to do was not taken up and disseminating and becoming mainstream across the world. So they become more, they weren't in the same sense avant-garde, although Frank Lloyd Wright would say had a lot of influence, of course, but whatever he had was the sort of cleansed of its Art Nouveau and ornamental residues, and then reappears in the Rietveld and Mies, and then that becomes modernism. And we really, why are these the heroes? Why are we paying so much attention? Why are we having still the history of architecture going over it over and over and over again? What happened and how it happened? Because it became the biggest thing. It became mainstream. That's why it is actually the avant-garde. If it wasn't, I mean, there are other avant-gardist movements happening at the time which didn't, inverted commas, convert into mainstream. No, they're forgotten, you know, they're left behind. Well, you know, like some of the work of Finsterlin and Bruno Tauder and all the expressionists and some of the Sharoon work. I mean, Sharoon was interesting that he came through. Not to dismiss it, but let's say, I think that's the key. The avant-garde is the destination, and why, you know, the whole point of having an avant-garde is to develop a new and upgrade the totality of the built environment, progressing it forward. It's not to remain marginal. I mean, that's the difference I have with Kipnis. He's saying, well, he's only interested in what we really are. We're not avant-gardists who will move mainstream. We are some kind of, oh God, I wish I remembered the phrase. Some kind of idiosyncratic demi-monde. We are like this kind of group of, Starship Enterprise aficionados who meet as a small group every year, and we have our own highly idiosyncratic pleasures and investments, and let us do that. We don't want to. We are this kind of group of aesthetes and connoisseurs who don't want anything else but have the pleasure of sharing these obsessions with each other, who nobody else. He kind of resigned. Nobody else cares about them, but I do. And let's meet. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be part of. I forgot his phrase, idiosyncratic or demi-monde. I mean, seriously, if that really was the end game, I would not want to be part of that. I want to be mainstream. Let's look, and we're trying, we're part of some kind of mainstream as architects, but it doesn't mean that the whole movement is fully mainstream. And at that point, and that's really what it is. I mean, why would we want to be? It's not about entertaining ourselves. It's about changing the world, right? Marx, the point of philosophy is not to reinterpret the world, it's to change the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick, for the fantastic talk. So we are looking forward, tomorrow will be the last lecture, and followed by the final review of the workshop. So welcome, join us tomorrow. Thank you so much. See you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I enjoyed that.